Okay, well, thanks everybody for tuning in. So, as you said, I'll keep these opening remarks relatively short, also because we are starting a bit behind schedule here, just to kind of give some big picture ideas, and then I'm happy to answer your questions. I'm just glancing down at my notes here. So, the big picture is I am very concerned about the United States in particular, and I guess the global economy, more generally over the next 5 years, let's say, for sure the next 10 years, meaning I would be shocked if there's not some major crisis in the United States within the next 10 years, and probably sooner than that. So certainly an economic one, but even more generally social. So let me just mention a few things here. Some of you may already know all these statistics, but and this is just standard stuff, but the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, the debt right now, the United States federal debt is 102% of GDP, and they're projecting that it's going to grow to 200% by the year 2050. And if you go and look, and those are very conservative projections, and it's not assuming that there's going to be a huge crisis, like another recession. This is just the stuff that's baked into the cake. Just autopilot. They're just looking at, hey, if outlays grow according to current law, looking at demographic trends in terms of Medicare and Social Security, and the way that that's going to play out, that they've accumulated so much debt just in the recent 10 years, let's say, when interest rates have been historically low, that now just little things like interest rates starting to gently go back up towards a more reasonable level, that alone is going to pose enormous problems for the US federal budget. So right now, for example, this year, the deficit is 10% of GDP. And to give you a frame of reference for the United States, that's the second largest since the year 1945, right? When we were just winding down from World War II. So you can see that this really is unprecedented level, not literally unprecedented, but unprecedented outside of wartime levels of spending. The Federal Reserve, for its part, just to give you a couple of points here, of course, ramped up significantly following the 2008 crisis with the various rounds of what is called quantitative easing. But then what they did last year in response to the pandemic dwarfed even that. So from March 2020 through March 2021, the Fed's assets went up by $3.3 trillion, which was a 78% increase. All right. Beyond just the magnitude of the Fed's purchases, also, if you go in and look at all the specifics of the various, emergency programs and things they started announcing in March and then April of last year, when the pandemic really, became a global phenomenon and different governments started really responding to it, you can just see they now have the authority. They haven't been exercising it too aggressively in certain categories, but they now have the ability. They can buy corporate bonds, like just flat out, the Fed can go buy corporate bonds. They tend to do it in terms of like ETFs and things like that, but they can buy individual ones, my understanding. Certainly asset-backed securities that consist of student loans, credit cards, or car loans. They abolished reserve requirements formally last March, so that it didn't kick in until I believe in April. But so at this point now, the United States banks have no formal reserve requirement. Last August, they officially switched from their old approach of what was called the dual mandate and how they were going to, how the Fed was going to conduct monetary policy, to they switched to what's called average inflation targeting. So most of you probably know what that means, but just real quickly to make sure I'm not losing anybody. So before last August, the Fed would say, oh, our inflation target is 2% for personal consumption expenditures was the particular metric of what the 2% was, annually, obviously. And then, but last August, they tweaked that and they said, what we're doing now is we're targeting the average. So what that means is if you have a few years where actual inflation is below what the target is, then they're going to tolerate or even shoot for a few years of above average inflation, so that over the entire period, the average is the target. Okay, so it might seem like a little semantic or quibble, but it's actually significant because before people had interpreted that the Fed had a ceiling, like, oh, if inflation's ever above 2%, according to their personal consumption expenditure metric, which itself is dubious, then they're really going to tighten policy because they want to bring it right down. And so now they're clarifying and saying, no, if we below average inflation, we're going to try to have above average to make up for it. So on average, so it's like, so the level of prices 5 years from now, people can coordinate on. So that's the rationale for it. And I won't talk too much more on this in the Q&A. If you want, I can give you more about, what the economists who are for this type of thing, what are they thinking? What kind of model do they have in mind? I can tell you that if you want. But in terms of what does that mean? I think part of what they're doing is they now have the freedom or the rhetorical excuse that if price inflation starts rising rapidly the next few years, at least in the beginning, they can say this is exactly what we want. Okay, so it's not going to be that they're violating their own targets. You actually have investment banks and other newsletters and things like that are being quoted in the mainstream financial press saying things like, oh, we might have transitory hyperinflation, which is a weird phrase to say it's hyperinflation transfer. So I'm just saying this is not normal. So obviously ever since 2008, sites like Zero Hedge or LouRockwell.com or places would be alarmist and warning about hyperinflation. But I'm saying this language has really spilled over into more mainstream outlets and people are more openly talking like it. So to be clear, I'm not predicting hyperinflation, just so you understand. I'm just saying that the tone has changed and it's like the culture is moving in the financial sector, at least in the United States, the way it's being discussed, where more and more people are saying, oh yes, we're getting ready for higher prices, but it's just going to be a transitory thing. So I'm just saying it's no longer like it went from like in 2009, 2010, people saying, no, we're in this glut, this big rut, it's not going to happen. Demand is too low. So now, most commentators are open to the idea that price inflation is going to be pretty high going forward. MMT, modern monetary theory. Again, I'll just briefly mention it, and then when you guys ask your questions, I can talk at more length if you want. But that was something that 10 years ago, I didn't know if it was ever going to catch on. It keeps gaining traction, and I see more and more sort of non-ideological financial commentators giving more credence to MMT, such that leaders in this movement, when she released her new book, I decided that I should really write a formal response. In other words, it's gained enough traction that I think Austrian economists and just more free market economists generally, we can't just make fun of it and just say, oh, you're just going to print money, haha. Like they're really, because they say things that are more sophisticated than that. And so to somebody who might be swayed by the MMT perspective, if it looks like all the critics can do is say, oh, you just want to print money, then that's going to confirm for them that the MMT people are onto something, because the MMT people have an official response. So, but the problem is, I do think MMT is totally wrong, and that, or at least it's very dangerous, that the elements of truth that it has make people think something that, endorse policy prescriptions that would be disastrous. And so that alarms me as well. So it's sort of, and then just more generally, I don't know how much this is filtered over the rest of the world, but the United States in the last 2 years, like, for lack of a better term, like everybody's gone insane. And there's math PhDs who are arguing with people on Twitter about whether 2 + 2 = 4. Okay, and I mean that quite literally. I mean, I'm sure some of you have seen these discussions, but that's quite a literal statement. I'm not exaggerating for rhetorical effect. And it's because of postmodernism and things like this that have seeped over into broader sectors of academia. But I'm just saying, I'm seeing this phenomenon in different areas where stuff that the experts would not have even questioned just 10 years ago now is like being openly discussed. And so again, math PhDs are arguing with people, and I don't mean that math PhDs are arguing with with plumbers. I mean, one group of math PhDs is saying 2 + 2 = 4, and another group of people who have PhDs in math are saying, well, no, maybe it doesn't. And they can get real esoteric about their definitions and what, so that's what I mean, that it's giving, I think like the idea of standards have just fallen away, and like no one knows what's true anymore. Like the very idea of, is there such a thing as truth, whether or not we can identify it or grab it. A lot of people now are saying, well, no, that's kind of a 19th century concept, or that's something associated with European imperialism, this idea that there's truth out there. Okay, so to me, that's a very alarming trend. Like I say, I see it all over in terms of my area, economics and economic policy. It's the MMT camp that really is just kind of like saying, well, why do we assume that government budget deficits will drive up interest rates, or why do you assume that printing money might cause prices to rise? So for example, the MMT people argue that what happened in interwar, the Weimar Republic in Germany with the hyperinflation, was that the rising prices caused the money stock to expand, as opposed to the more conventional explanations. The reason the mark collapsed was because the German government printed too many marks. Whereas the MMT people flip it and say, no, it's because the rising prices that, the German central bank just passively expanded the money supply. And, so I'm saying things like that there's like normally when you disagree with something, like if I disagree with Paul Krugman, we can push back the level until we reach common agreement. Like we can agree on what money is, we can agree on what taxes are, and and then we go for. And I'm saying now with these debates, like you have to go so far back to reach agreement with somebody that you might even go back to the idea of, is there such a thing as a correct answer to this question? And some people might say no, just all in your head. So I'm just saying this sort of thing is really alarming to me, and I think it's opening the door to all sorts of terrible policies. And I think the only thing that's really going to sort of shock Americans out of this mindset is a crisis needs to occur. And so the last thing I'll mention is that what I unveiled at a recent conference in New Hampshire, and Gillette asked me to just touch on this briefly, and then I'll stop and turn over your guys' questions, is I have now become a public proponent of the idea of Texas breaking away from the rest of the United States. So that was always something that, as a libertarian, I endorsed the principle of self-determination. And if a group of people don't want to be part of a broader political entity, then they should be able to leave without coercion or violence. But I think it's, to me, I think that there's going to be low level, I don't necessarily want to use the word civil war, but certainly violence in the streets in the United States within the next 10 years because of all these problems I'm seeing. And to me, it makes a lot of sense for people who want various states to break away to start doing that now, like to start preparing, to start like getting the public warmed up, at the very least, to just say, hey, suppose hypothetically, 72% of the people in Texas voted in a referendum that they wanted to leave. The rest of the U.S. would let them do that, right? Like just as to get it on record. Like, let's talk about this now before I think it's going to happen. So anyway, I'll stop there because I'm not sure what you guys want me to focus on, but I cannot stress enough that the things I've been seeing, and I'm not somebody who's always an alarmist. Okay, it's the things I'm seeing though. It's not just economic policy. So since 2008, I've been very critical of what the Federal Reserve has been doing, but now I'm just seeing the way the media has been and the way things online are happening, the way the public discussion has been steered and regulated by media giants and things like that. That it's, to me, the U.S. is on a very bad trajectory. And unfortunately, I don't think it's going to fix itself gradually. I think there's going to have to be a shock to snap out of this and to head back towards a more rational direction. Okay, so I'll stop there and turn to the questions.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Just so I know how to organize the questions, how much time do we have?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
I can at least certainly go for another hour from this point. Is that good?
That's fine.
Okay.
Good. So in that case, let me just make a comment that this call is thanks to the generosity of Hagai, And if you guys want to chip in and help him to finance this call, then his bit number is 050-7511-1105. Again, and I'll say it in Hebrew, המספר ביט של חגי זה 050-75-1111-05. And let's move to my first question, which is if you can say a few words about the entire issue of global warming or climate change, because you've spent years, I think, researching this subject, and you have a rather interesting point of view, which I think most people don't understand or don't know of, which kind of relates to what Nordhaus said a few years ago.
Right.
So if you can just say a few words about that.
Okay, sure. So yes, for those who don't know, so I think I'm trying to think of the timeline. Let's see, that would have been 2000. So around, I think 2008, I started working for what was called the Institute for Energy Research, which is a Washington, D.C. based free market think tank that specializes in energy issues. And what they assigned me to really study and to get into the details of was the what then was called the global warming debate, and then since has turned into climate change is the label now. And obviously, as an economist, I was focusing on the economics of it. And so what's interesting is in the beginning, for those of you who are following the debate, and I have a US bias, obviously, the way like Republican politicians or pundits who are typically, right-wing conservative types, if they didn't endorse radical policies that would drastically reduce carbon dioxide emissions, they would say things like, oh, well, there's a lot of uncertainties in the sign. Like that was kind of their move. And so the people, the Democrats and more typically, people on the left, environmentalist types, they would say, oh, well, you have to go follow the science. You're a science denier. You're a climate change denier, evoking obviously a Holocaust denier baggage with those phrases. But what happened is over time, the demands for government restrictions got so aggressive that even the standard published literature doesn't come anywhere close to supporting them. And so it flipped to where most of my work for the Institute for Energy Research, like if somebody recommended an emissions target or a goal in terms of like atmospheric concentration of certain greenhouse gases, I would just have to go to like the UN's own, it's the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's the document, or it's the huge books that the UN publishes periodically to summarize, the state of the art of physical climate science, in terms of the chemistry and physics of it, and then also the economics literature in terms of policies designed to mitigate climate change. And so I would just have to go quote from the UN's own documents to show that no, these more radical proposals had nothing to do with it. So the most striking example of this mismatch was in 2018. It would have been around September or October, I think. It was the same weekend this happened that the United Nations IPCC published what they called a special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So this whole document was just giving, policymakers and the public, the various research were to say, hey, if we were going to try to limit cumulative global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, these are the policies we would need. Here's how we could do it. What could we do with, funding for electric vehicles, insulation? How could we, people need to stop eating so much meat, right? So it was the whole document's function was to tell the world, this is what the scientists are telling us for this goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So to be clear, it didn't say we ought to do this. It just said, if you wanted to do it, here's how you would do it. But of course, why are they publishing that unless that's a good thing to do, right? So it was a pretty careful rhetorical position they put themselves in. And moreover, they didn't even try to justify it. So I'm not saying that they tried to justify it and failed. I'm saying they admitted explicitly, we're taking this goal as externally given to us. and we're just giving recommendations to policymakers about here's various, ways to do it, like in the least cost manner, for example. The same weekend that they released that document, William Nordhaus, an economist, won the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Memorial Prize, in economics for his pioneering work on climate change, right? So William Nordhaus is a huge figure in economics. He was a co-author with Paul Samuelson on Samuelson's famous, best-selling economics textbook. Paul Krugman, I think, was a TA for Nordhaus when Krugman was getting his PhD. And so anyway, Nordhaus, he has this model called DICE. It's Dynamic Integrated Climate Economic Model or something like that. So it's a model that looks at the physical science, what the biologists and chemists and physicists are saying about climate change, and then plugs that as inputs into a model of just the global macroeconomy, just to try to come up with the trade-offs to say, well, if we limited emissions this amount, we would reduce climate change damage, but then that would slow conventional economic growth because energy prices would be higher. And, here's the trade-offs. So Nordhaus's model, the most recent version, that he's published on, it was numbers from 2016, showed that if all the governments did the so-called optimal carbon tax, there would be global warming of 3.5 degrees Celsius. So in Nordhaus's framework, the way that to manage the externalities and to have marginal cost equals marginal benefit and so forth would allow for 3.5 C. So that would be the optimal target to limit global warming to 3.5 C, as opposed to the 4 degrees Celsius that he thinks would happen naturally without intervention. And he didn't even address the 1.5 C target, because in his mind that's not going to happen. Like it's so far beyond even plausibility that there's no point. He instead, though, formally studied a 2.5 C ceiling, and he found that yes, that would reduce climate change damages, right? If you cut down on emissions so much that the globe only warmed by 2.5 C, there's less climate change, so less damages from that. But that would so much hurt economic growth that he concluded that the damages so far outweigh the benefits on the margin that it would be better if governments did nothing at all. Okay, so he's not merely saying there's a better policy out there. He's saying one of the better policies would be to do nothing. So that's how bad, and that was just the weaker 2.5 C ceiling. A 1.5 C would be even worse, right? If they slam the brakes so much. So my point is just the same weekend, the Nobel Committee gives the award to a guy who's saying the 1.5 C target is so bad, humanity would be better off just ignoring climate change altogether rather than try to do such a crazy goal. And the UN releases this document telling all the governments, here's how to strive for a 1.5 C target. But if you looked at the press coverage, like nobody in the general public would have any idea that was, like I was one of the few people who even knew that and was telling people this. Like the New York Times, this is the last thing I'll say, the New York Times had a story covering both events because, again, they happened the same weekend. So they were, and the coverage made it look like we all know how bad climate change is. The Nobel Committee is rewarding Nordhaus for his work. UN's telling us 1.5 C, we got to strive for this because look at all the fish that are dying, and and there's wildfires and there's tornadoes, and so a normal person would think Nordhaus's work supported the target when in fact it was the exact opposite. So that's an example of what we're saying is this huge mismatch between what the actual, and again, Nordhaus is not, a fan of Murray Rothbard. He is a conventional Keynesian economist who pioneered work. He is, very much in favor of massive government intervention to slow climate change. It's just he's saying the 1.5 C target is ludicrous. Sorry, his work says that. He doesn't say it. The New York Times asked him, do you think we can still hit the 1.5 C target? And he just said, no, at this point, I think that's that's implausible, that we've emitted too much. So what he said was a true statement, but he didn't say, and thank goodness, because that's a stupid idea. He just kept his mouth shut because here he's getting his award and he wanted everyone to celebrate him.
Okay, so fine. I'll ask one more question that I have, and then I'll start asking the questions that I got from others. And my question is, my second and last is on the interest rate in a place like Israel, because I know that, based on the Austrian economics and maybe also common sense, it makes more sense for the free market to determine the interest rate. And everyone is now at zero interest rate, artificially or not, whatever, because of the action of central banks. And I understand why some like the US, like in a place like the US, it makes sense to simply abolish the Fed and let free markets do what they do. Can a country like Israel, which is a small and open economy, decide to simply shut down the central bank, let the forces of free market to determine the interest rate, or will it be the case that a small economy in a world where everything is determined by central banks, the interest rate here will go up, and then there's going to be like a huge inflow of capital, and then the export industry is going to be destroyed, and so on and so forth. So really, to distill my question to the last sentence, can a place like Israel abolish our own central bank, or because we're a small open economy, we don't have a choice but to play by the rules set by people like the Fed, ECB, and so on?
Okay, that's a really interesting question. I haven't thought about that too much before, so I think the quick answer is I'm going to say it never, if you take a group of people and you're saying, should they be allowed to have contractual freedom to deal with the rest of the world, or would they be better off if some third party came in and put constraints on what transactions they were allowed to make? Generally speaking, it's going to be pretty unusual if the second option is better. And so kind of go in reverse then, okay, if people who happen to be living in Israel now have more freedom to make contractual arrangements with people, I think that's a good thing, and that helps them. And so in that sense, yes, getting rid of Israel's central bank and allowing more freedom in the financial sector for Israelis would help them on average, or on net on average. Now, having said that, though, I think you're right. Probably the bigger the group, the more the benefits outweigh the costs. You know what I mean? Because yes, there obviously is going to be problems with and switching between any kind of regime. And there's in general, changing policies has winners and losers. And so I think you're probably right that if the U.S. were to get rid of the Fed, that might be easier for Americans than if Israel got rid of its central bank, and what the impact would be on Israelis in general. That could be true. That might be true. I'd have to think more about that. But the other thing too is it could even flip the other way, in the sense that it might not have as big an impact. That certainly, like one individual just operating in the world, whether what does it even mean to say, what if there was a central bank controlling what he did? You know what I mean? So it's whether or not there's a central bank telling one person what to do or not is not going to affect global interest rates or anything. So it's probably more that the way to reconcile my early answers, I think that yes, getting rid of a central bank confers more benefits than costs, but the smaller the population that's being affected by the policy change, the smaller the numbers are, and so it's not as big a deal one way or the other. So you're right. If they might not see interest rates go up too much in terms of day-to-day activity in Israel, because if the ECB and the Federal Reserve and the Bank of Japan influence your credit markets a lot, compared to the United States credit markets are primarily influenced by what the Federal Reserve does. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. So I agree with you. That does matter. I do think though you're right. Like another example or a similar thing would be, like, I know there were a lot of American countries that rely heavily on certain agricultural or commodity exports, and when the Federal Reserve engaged in easy money policies following the 2008 crisis, that put those countries in a difficult position, because they had to say, are we just going to let our currency appreciate against the dollar, and then that's going to hurt our exports? or do we, does our central bank just follow the dollar down? So yeah, with those things, again, it does cause problems in terms of different sectors, but I think, there's just the standard economics of it. If foreigners are willing to give you a bunch of cheap capital, that doesn't make your country poorer, but it could make certain individuals poorer. But in general, some company, if foreigners are giving you gifts at a lower price, and that actually makes your country richer. But again, it's very easy to say in terms of averages, and certain sectors definitely could get hit.
Okay, I'll tell you what, I mean, just to summarize, I certainly, if I were to become the dictator of the state of Israel tomorrow, which is unlikely, I won't have the guts to do this experiment. I'll do other stuff, but this thing I'm not going to touch. But okay, let me move to some questions that people sent me. And the first one is from Lior, who's also, I think, an anarcho-capitalist. So we have those in Israel. He's asking about Bitcoin. And specifically, do you think if the value of Bitcoin stabilizes, as in the volatility drops, what are the chances of Bitcoin really becoming a way for people to make payments? And I guess the overall, maybe larger question is, what do you think about Bitcoin overall?
Okay, so let me mention before I forget, if you want to, a while ago with a co-author, Silas Barta, I wrote a guide. Like it wasn't giving investment implications. It was just explaining the actual mechanics of how does Bitcoin work, and then like putting it into an economic framework. So if you want to see something like that assumes nothing, and then step by step keeps adding complexity and realism, then this is what you want. So that's at understandingbitcoin.us is where we have that. It's a free PDF if you want to go look at that. So back when we wrote that, I wasn't sure whether Bitcoin was going to take off or not, but I thought it was important just to clarify some of the economic concepts involved. So that's why we wrote that. So now I'm much more comfortable predicting that. Let me put it this way. I think in the year 2100, people are still going to pay very close attention. Like it's going to matter who owns the Bitcoins, because there's a sense in which it's always going to exist. But if it fell away, nobody would care. But yeah, I think in 2100, Bitcoin will still have significant market value, and people will know. What I'm not so sure about is, will it be used? Like, will transactions be denominated in Bitcoins, for example, or will people be using Bitcoin transfers as a major component of their purchases, or will Bitcoin be more like big gold bars, like in today's world? So right now, if you found a gold bar, you would certainly keep it. It'd be very valuable, but you're not buying and selling things with fractional claims on these big gold bars. And so the specific problem is, as I'm sure many people know, just the network, the way Bitcoin is designed, it's hard to do a lot of transactions with the actual, even though you can divide an individual Bitcoin down to the 8th decimal place, which they call a Satoshi, still, like 50 years from now, I don't think it's going to be the case that you're going to go buy a cup of coffee by transferring some fractional units of Bitcoin. The one way though it could get to there is you can have, this is things like with the Lightning Network and whatnot. So even though the underlying Bitcoins themselves and the actual blockchain ledger that keeps track of who owns the actual Bitcoins, the base level, you could have on top of that claims on those that are transferred more easily. And the analog, just how to make sense of that is, that's how our financial system works right now. So let me just use the United States. Federal Reserve notes, like $100 bill with a picture of U.S. dignitaries on it, that's the base money. And then Citibank or Bank of America, my checking account balance is actually claims issued by Bank of America that are redeemable in the base money. Okay, and so that would be the analogy, that the Bitcoins themselves could be the base, and then you could have a whole global network of transactions pyramided on top of that. So whether it's going to be that or a different cryptocurrency that by its very design can scale up and and displace credit cards and conventional bank transfers of government issued fiat money to handle day-to-day transactions, that I'm not as confident about. But I do think some version of cryptocurrency uh, 50 years from now will be at least a portion of global transactions. And I do think no matter what happens, I think people will a Bitcoin will have a significant market value 100 years from now. But whether it will be like the foundation of the global commerce system or whether it will be like having a Van Gogh painting in a safe somewhere, that one I'm not as sure about.
Okay, I'll move to a question by Daniel Kishonovsky. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Daniel Kishonovsky. Anyway, the question is, do you think the reason Austrians have a disdain for mathematical models is because they were unhappy with the way, classical economists were misusing them, or is there something more principled about the objection of mathematical models? And do you yourself use mathematical models in your work, in your research? Do you think it's an important part of Austrian economics?
Okay, great question. Let me answer the second one first. That's easier. So for me personally, so when I was at New York University, not Tel Aviv University, when I was at New York University, my dissertation was on Austrian economics and a lot of the historical work of Eugen von Bavard, who was a giant in the Austrian school. But in terms of just going through NYU, what was called my what do they call it? My field. So it's kind of like saying your major, like what's the area of specialization in terms of the classes I took and the exams you had to pass to get through. Like some people would do macro, some would do labor. I did what was called theory, and that was like microeconomics and game theory. And so game theory is actually very technical, very formal. Formal is probably a better word to describe. Somebody might say mathematical, but that's a little bit misleading. It's just more, everything was very precise and using a lot of theorems and things like this for very particular results that have to do with like, oh, you needed to know set theory from math to be able to know, is there going to be an equilibrium in this game of not, n tuples. And so my point is, the way I viewed it was, if you're going to introduce formalism and have Greek letters in your models, you might as well just go all the way, like be consistent and assume everybody's hyper rational and go ahead and model things as if you're looking at a little simulation with robots in it and go ahead and compute your equilibria that way. Whereas like macro, the way it was done at NYU, it was sort of like a mixture. It was like the worst of both worlds, that it had unrealistic assumptions, but it also had like some ad hoc things that, well, let's assume that prices update every week and that prices are sticky, and you know what I mean. So it was sort of like you were going to have a little bit of the formalism, but then also not. And so to me, like I said, to me, it wasn't realistic, and it also wasn't the purity of let's assume that people are robots and follow things rationally. So I did appreciate game theory, and there's a certain, I have a few ideas of things I want to publish in like regular journals, not Austrian journals. And I do appreciate how like I have to make subtle distinctions, and the formal language that mainstream economists use is going to be critical for that. Like I'm going to be able to illustrate, I'm going to be saying, you guys keep saying this causes this, but you're making a mistake because actually it's more subtle. And if you look at it this way, then you can see how there's the certain exception, and that could be misleading you. It's to say it in words, they might not know what I'm saying. Whereas if I put it into a formal model and just show them, so you see in this equilibrium, look at this happening, anybody who knows how to read the Greek symbols is going to know what I'm saying. So that is an advantage. So when you're asking me in my work, if I'm trying to talk to mainstream economists, yes, at various points in my career, it's been very useful. For example, a chapter or an appendix in my dissertation that I got published in a history of thought journal was to say dangers of the one good model. And I'll be really quick here, but mainstream economists, like I was taught this at NYU, they think, oh yeah, in a competitive market, the real wage rate in equilibrium equals the marginal product of labor. And they think the real interest rate equals the marginal product of capital. And that second claim is very dubious. And so the Austrian school doesn't agree with that. They think interest has to do with time preference, not with the productivity of capital. And it took me a while to figure out how can I reconcile these two? Because you got the verbal Austrian tradition, which I know is right economically, but these models I was being taught at NYU, there wasn't the math was correct. So what the heck is going on? And I realized what it was is the math models at NYU, to make it simple and what they called tractable so that you could solve it, there was only one good. So the same good was the capital good that also could be eaten. So it was a consumption good and a capital good at the same time, the same physical thing. So they would use examples like sheep that just multiply, or like some kind of fruit that just multiplies, and that was the capital stock, was how many head of sheep do you have? And you can either consume them now or just sit back and they grow by 10%. And so I pointed out that in that mentality, the Austrian distinctions disappear because it's the same good. And so then I just, I had a two good model, just to, I wrote out the equations and just showed them, see, in the two good model, the real interest rate doesn't equal the marginal product of capital. And then, but the equations reduce to that if you made them the same thing. So that's, anyway, I'm saying I could do all that in a formal setting. So I use it there. But if I didn't have the verbal Austrian tradition, I might not have realized they were making that mistake. So that's kind of, so the math is useful to express something, but I think the verbal Austrian tradition is still critical. So then now your first question of why historically did the Austrians not like it? I want to be clear. It wasn't because they weren't good at math. It wasn't that the Austrians couldn't do the math. And so they said, well, it's dumb. Mises, you read him, Mises' brother is a famous mathematician, Richard von Mises, if people have heard of him. Like, he has some, results that are still cited to this day in terms of probability theory. I guess just because his brother's good at math doesn't mean he is, but I'm saying like Mises came from a family that revered math and they were smart boys. And so you read Human Action, and Mises makes very detailed points about quantum physics, and so he certainly had the ability. And his problem with math was using math and economics was, he said, like physicists and chemists, they assume, and we hope that it's true, that there's constants in nature, right? There's the charge on an electron, there's the gravitational constant, things like this, and that the so-called laws of nature hold steady. And so in that kind of setting, it does make sense to then go ahead and and use mathematical approach and use the empirical scientific method to try to grope your way towards true laws. And whereas he said in economics, that's not how you do it. And the last thing I'll say is, he would use the analogy of geometry. And so just think about how we do geometry. Like, if you want to prove the Pythagorean theorem to someone, you don't state what it says and then say, go measure 1,000 right triangles and see how closely the hypotenuse, approximates the square, some of the square two sides, the square of the hypotenuse, right? You prove it. And then once you prove it, you say, now that's true. Given the assumptions behind it, this conclusion has to be true. Or if you think it's not, look at the proof and show me where the mistake in the reasoning was. If you went out measuring triangles to try to prove it, you would be misunderstanding the enterprise of Euclidean geometry. So that's what Mises thought economic law was, but he wasn't against empirical investigation. Mises actually, with Hayek, set up a center to study business cycle, and they looked at crop prices and commodity prices and things like that. So the reason Mises was skeptical of empiricism and then the mathematical approach is he thought economists saw the success in the natural sciences and thought, oh, well, to be scientific, we have to do the same sort of methods. And he was saying, no, there's a qualitative difference between studying intentional beings, what you do in the social sciences, versus inanimate matter, which is what you do in the natural sciences.
Okay, so look, I want us to have enough time for people to simply ask questions from the crowd, basically, be a little bit spontaneous. But before that, I'm going to ask one more question that I wanted to ask, which is about this very interesting topic of Texas independence. And the obvious question, I guess, to ask, and I'm sure you're getting that a lot, is you did have a civil war. So what stops the federal government from declaring war on Texas if indeed, they want to be independent? Why not another civil war?
Okay, great question. And that's obviously a huge thing, and that's something I personally wrestled with before I decided, am I going to publicly start pushing this? Is I don't want to push Americans towards a thing that's going to end up in mass bloodshed, obviously. So one quick answer is I personally believe states are going to break up no matter what. In other words, I don't think it's a question of, oh, if some of us push this, we're going to cause a thing to happen that's bad and going to lead to violence. Like, I think at some point the dollar is going to crash. Washington, D.C. is not going to be able to keep sending money to various groups and keeping them, docile or placated. And so I think once that system breaks down, I think various entities are going to break off anyway. So to me, it's going to happen regardless. Now, if you disagree with me, then my answer is not going to satisfy you. But so that's why I wanted it to be more orderly. So that's why I was saying we should talk about this now, start getting the logistics done now while it's still like a hypothetical thing, rather than a big crash comes and then people are scrambling trying to do it then under duress. But more generally, look, there's been lots of things. So yes, the U.S. Civil War is a bad example of when someone tried to implement that and awful things happened. But you've got Brexit. So there was problems with Brexit and people worried about trade sanctions and things, but nobody really thought, or at least it wasn't a big concern in terms of the news that I saw, that there was going to be an invasion and mass slaughter of people because they had the audacity to try to break away. Catalonia is trying. There's secessionist movements in Quebec, so there's lots of places around the world where groups are wanting to break away, and those don't have the historical tainting of the U.S. Civil War. So I mean, this idea is out. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc countries breaking away, so I'm saying the idea of a smaller political unit breaking away from a larger one, the U.S. Civil War is not the only time that ever happened, right? So this is something that's, standard. The U.S. independence, from Great Britain was a secessionist movement itself. Now, there was a war there too, don't get me wrong. So, but beyond that, I think, and that's partly why I want to say we should start talking about this now. That's part of the reason for me doing it, is to say, let's minimize the chance of that if people just start openly debating it. Like, that's why I want it to be part of the national debate in the United States, is so that a few years down the road, if people do vote for it, the rest of America will be ready for it. Like, that won't be a shock that then if the federal government says, well, this is completely crazy, we got to send in troops to stop it. I want this to have been discussed, and I want to get it on the record, and to have polls of Americans and say, you may disagree strongly with it, but if 70% of Texans voted to leave, would you let them go peacefully? And I think it would be hard for them, when it's still an abstract thing, to say, no, we're going to bomb them into submission. And we can quote from the Declaration of Independence, and to say Americans are kind of founded on this idea of self-government and whatever. And so that's what I would say. Beyond that, though, part of what happened in the Civil War, and historians can debate this, is technically the Confederates did fire first. Now they can argue why they were put into an impossible position, but I'm saying, if it were just like Texas, they're not going to go and send planes to go bomb Washington. That would be insane, right? So it's sort of like there's such a mismatch that everybody would know it's not that the Texans pose a threat to the rest of the United States. If they want to leave, that's their business, and maybe it's a bad idea. But I would like to think it would be hard for the rest of America to be convinced that this. Now, the way they could do it, last thing I'll say, the way they could do it is they would say stuff like, oh, well, there's a lot of, right-wing militia groups who are now moving to Texas, and they're building up stockpiles of weapons, and, they're going to use those down the road. And so we have to, we can't let this just be this open land of anarchy. So that's the way they would do it. They wouldn't say, like Washington's position would not be, no, these people aren't allowed to leave because we want their tax revenue, so we're going to drop bombs up. They can't say that. But what they could say is, look at all these underground groups the FBI has identified, and it's more police action. We're going in just to maintain law and order and gun control, and to stop terrorism. That's the way they would justify it. And so I agree with you. That is a definite concern. And again, that's why I want to get let's have people talk about this openly to try to minimize that.
Yeah, I'll tell you, it's a fascinating topic. For many reasons, one of which is, just like you say, state secession, I think, or at least there's a good reason to think that it's going to be, it's in your future. Maybe even sooner than later. And I have many more questions. However,
yeah, by the way, one last real quick thing. And so that's why, I mean, I'm using the term secession because we all know what that means, but partly to try to disassociate it from the link to the Civil War. The way I'm talking about it probably is to call it Texas independence, which it is, but you know what I mean? To say, don't think of it as secession, think of it as Texans being independent. And, and for those who don't know, Texas originally was its own country. It was the Republic of Texas before it joined the Union of the United States.
Okay, I have many more questions, but we have many people on the call, so I want to let them have the chance to ask questions. So basically, everyone who wants to ask a question, just unmute yourself and shout a question. And if you don't have questions, that's fine. I have plenty more. So we're going to force Bob to stay here for the duration. So guys, just please go ahead. Ask questions.
Hello, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
It's regarding the math question you talked about earlier. So you kind of implied that Austrian economics, like the verbal statements of Austrian economics, are more solid in the sense that you gave the analogy of the Pythagorean theorem, like they always hold and so on. However, what would you say against the criticism that having verbal statements might not be as formal and might contain some loopholes, and finally you might end up with statements which are not true. For example, take the Austrian business cycle theory, or what the Austrian amateurs such as myself think of as the Austrian business cycle theory. The whole you play with the interest rates and blah, 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 and boom and bust and everything. It's a very intuitive and concise explanation, but if you treat it like as a theorem or something like this, I mean, it clearly, there are many ways to attack it. And for example, why does it not correspond with some empirical evidence? Put aside the question of does empiricism have anything to do to interact with this, or phenomena such as switching and re-switching and whatever. Obviously, this is not the entire story. So, and you might make it sound like it is. Look, it's a theorem. It obviously you decrease the interest rate. You're going to cause malinvestments and all the mechanism we all know about. So where does it break, if in your opinion it breaks, and where does the loose verbal statements leave room for perhaps wrong interpretation? I hope I made myself clear.
Yeah, definitely. Incidentally, while you were talking, I realized somebody could have a very good objection. Yours was good too. Your question, your concern was good. But in my answer to the previous question, I sort of conflated empiricism with math, because someone said, why doesn't Austrians use math? And I gave an answer about geometry. Well, someone could say, well, isn't geometry part of math, right? So I didn't really show Austrians don't or shouldn't use math by saying Austrian economics is kind of like geometry, because geometry is actually math, right? So there really it was more about, the like a priori deduction versus empiricism is that's where the geometry analogy is useful. So to answer your question, here's what I would say. Using logical deductions from sort of basic principles. Let me back up a second. I had a debate with David Friedman at the Pork Fest Festival several years ago. It's on YouTube if you want to look it up, where we were arguing over economic method. And this is going to be, I think, relevant. And so I made the point, and I said, look, for those of us who call ourselves free traders, like we believe in the principle of free trade, we don't think government should have tariffs, or at least not having tariffs for economic objectives. Like if the governments just need to raise revenue, maybe a tariff's a good idea, but not to have tariffs to create jobs and things. For those of us who have those beliefs and those insights, I said, where did you get that? Think back to your own intellectual development. What turned you into a free trader where you believed in free trade and were against protectionism? I said, it probably wasn't that you looked at a bunch of econometric studies of different countries and how they varied their tariff rates, and you saw, the p-value on this, regression was such and such, and so with 98% confidence, I can say lowering tariffs will probably raise GDP in the next 3 quarters by such. I said, that's probably not what it was. It was probably you read something very simple like Frederick Bastiat's Petition of the Candle Makers, just a real simplistic thought experiment where you just thought through the logic of international trade, and you realized, you had an epiphany and realized, oh my gosh, we wouldn't block sunlight out to create jobs for candle makers, or in wartime, we try to hurt the enemy by blockading them and stopping goods from getting in. So how could it possibly be true that the way our government's going to make us richer is by keeping out cheap imports? That doesn't make any sense, right? And so I was saying, like, that's the way economic understanding, I think, is conveyed. And so that's kind of what Mises is saying about, the way to understand the principles of economics is by introspection and thinking through logical implications of concepts, not going and measuring stuff and running an experiment even. So having said all that, though, in practice, it's hard to know in a real world case what the cause and effect was. So for example, they did raise the minimum wage a few times, I think like in 2007 and 2008. And so I could know using a priori reasoning that other things equal, raising the minimum wage reduces employment. But I wouldn't say the Great Recession was the fault of the minimum wage increase, right? That's just my empirical hunch, my feeling as an economist, my judgment. I don't think so. And likewise, you could think, if the central bank pushes down interest rates, that's going to cause an unsustainable boom that's going to lead to a bust. But maybe it would be real small. Maybe in the grand scheme of things, other, like Schumpeterian innovation is a much bigger factor in terms of industry flows and what happens to stock prices. Maybe the Austrian business cycle theory is just a little blip that, explains 1% of things, right? So something could be a true a priori logically deduced theorem in terms of economics, but maybe it's practically not very important. And so there, you do need to use empirical investigation to get a handle on that. And like I said, Mises and Hayek wouldn't disagree. They literally set up a center to gather all sorts of data to, understand business cycles. So they didn't just think you just, study your little logical demonstration. You don't look out at the real world.
Thank you. But I'm still, if I can take up a bit more time, do you think as the simplistic version of the Austrian business cycle theory, would you call it true in the sense that, because I think some extensions of it are inconsistent with the basic stuff. So would you feel comfortable calling it true? Well, there's the entire switching, reswitching debate and whatever.
Okay, so for those who don't know, what the questioner is asking about is there was this famous, it was the Cambridge Capital controversy. The UK and the Massachusetts Cambridge schools argued it was like the Schroffians versus like the neoclassical mainstream, and it had to do with capital theory. And ironically, what I was alluding to earlier with, does interest equal the marginal product of capital? So the mainstream guys like Solow and Paul Samuelson, whatever, they were using simplistic models that said interest is a reflection of the productivity of capital. So it sort of gave it a moral legitimacy, whereas the Schroffians said, no, it's based on power relationships. And part of the demonstration was to show you can come up with models where at a high interest rate, one productive technique is favored. If you lower the interest rate, a different method of production, with different inputs to make the same output, becomes more profitable. And then if you keep lowering the interest rates even more, then it switches back to the first technique. And so the point was, you can't look at a real world economy and just say, if there's more savings that pushes down interest rates, the economy switches to a more capitalistic or roundabout process that's more productive. And that's how we justify the income that the capitalists are earning as opposed to the workers. And so, yes, it's true. You're right. Some of the stories Austrians might tell about how the business cycle works might rely on certain, implications that technically, you can't prove rigorously. So you're right that it's sort of a fable, that it's certainly not as rigorous as the Pythagorean theorem. I'll put it that way. And also there's a difference between like a closed economy versus something that, like, as Gilad's earlier question about the central bank, versus a Hong Kong embedded in the whole world. How does Austrian business cycle theory work there? So people are trying to make extensions, and you're right, in practice sometimes, and this is kind of what David Friedman was saying to me too. He was saying in practice, economists all kind of do similar things. Like even mainstream economists, they have a theory that has crisp predictions, and then they go measure it. You know what I mean? So you use logic and deduction to say, what does my theory predict will happen? And then you go use empiricism to see if it came true. So I don't know if me saying that is more answering that. Yeah, I think you could strip down Austrian business cycle theory to a simple enough statement that it's necessarily true, but possibly not very relevant. But in practice, yeah, a lot of times Austrians might, when they're talking to the public, make some sweeping statements that are actually either not defendable or false under certain circumstances.
Okay, anyone has other questions?
May I ask a question?
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. Bob, thank you very much. Let me quickly introduce myself. I'm Hillel Gershuni. I am columnist here in Israel. I wrote extensively about the free markets and so on. I'm not a libertarian myself, and I very like your shows, and I listen to them almost every week. I have a question about the libertarian movement at a whole, and regarding COVID, for example. So it seems like you were, I think, in a minority that says that masks are, you should wear masks, and I think that on the whole, in the US and also here in Israel, libertarians have some resentment to authority, so they didn't judge the pandemic as worse as it is. So do you think that is the case? So their bias against authority and against government led them to this, I think, not judging well the risk and hazard of the pandemic.
Okay, good question. So just to give more background for listeners, yeah, so when the pandemic started, I had someone in my household who had a very serious lung condition. And so we were much more following, the COVID-19 before it was like a standard public discussion. And we were wearing N95 masks, right? So the ones that are for healthcare professionals. I shaved my beard because I knew it had to be a type. So I believe that yes, the proper use of an N95 mask is certainly better than not wearing a mask. I was never in favor of government mandates, and I also recognize that if somebody just takes something and puts it over and goes into a store like this, that's not doing anything, right? So I just to be clear about what my position on masks. But yeah, and also ironically, we were wearing N95 masks when our government was telling us not to. And so, it dovetailed with the, not listening to authority figures at the earlier point, and then they flipped, obviously. So you're right. That was something that concerned me. I think you might be getting a false impression. So there are a lot of libertarians, like self-identified libertarians, who were very concerned about COVID. It's not a perfect segregation, but generally speaking, the people like there are left libertarians versus ones who are on the right. So the ones on the left tended to be more open to the idea that, this is a serious public health threat and we have to change our behavior. Yes, the government shouldn't be mandating it, but you as a responsible individual should be very careful, to not give this to the elderly or, so forth. Whereas it was more people who would call themselves right-wing libertarians in the US context, at least, who were, oh, this is crazy. Oh, look at this idiot wearing a mask over there. You just do whatever the government says. Ha ha. Can't you read the science? So that is true. And I was very disturbed by, that dichotomy. And yes, a lot of the rhetoric that came out, and put it this way, this is what I'll say. Some libertarians basically admitted, and some quite literally, that yes, in a free market, it would just be, whether there's a pandemic or not, people's behavior, you could just do whatever you wanted. And if you thought there was a dangerous virus out there, you could just stay home. But like me, I get to do whatever I want if I lived in a free society. Like a libertarian world means I can just do whatever I want. And not even allowing for, like, could private property, store owners on their own property have a mask mandate for anybody who enters their premises, even in principle. Like some libertarians were going so far as to say, no, you can't tell me what to do. That's interfering. So, which to me, that's just misunderstanding like libertarianism 101. And the reason it concerned me in particular is a lot of these people earlier, like a few years earlier, when there was, as I'm sure many of you know, there was a debate in the US when homosexual marriage became, federal, nationally mandated, Supreme Court, whatever. And so there were some Christian bakers who, because of their religious views, didn't think marriage could be between two men or two women. And so a couple would come in and want a cake, and they would just say, "I'm sorry, but I can't do this in good conscience because my religion." And there, the standard libertarian position was, "Hey, it's a store owner; they can do whatever they want." And so I'm thinking, like, it. Whereas when they were being asked to wear a mask, it was like, "No, you can't tell me to wear a mask. I'm going to go and do whatever." You know what I mean? So it seemed very convenient for a lot of people that it was okay. Store owners could do whatever they want when it was going to inconvenience other customers, but when it was going to inconvenience them, then all of a sudden libertarianism changed. So, that was the element of it that concerned me. And you're right. Once that happens, when people want the answer to be a certain thing ideologically, then yes, you're going to be able to go find medical people who give support to what you see what I'm saying. So they can certainly go find a host of people, and it didn't help that the people who hated Donald Trump were going and trumpeting every alarmist who was saying, "Oh, COVID-19 is going to kill 20% of the population if we don't lock down." So, I mean, it's, the extremists were on both sides, obviously, but yes, if I'm answering your question, there was a large portion of certainly US-based libertarians that I thought went way beyond just disagreeing with government coercion, but also, were being very flippant about, what the actual medical science. The thing I'll say is I saw examples of the same people who would say masks won't protect you from COVID because if you look at the diameter of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, it can fit through the mask. But they also would say, "Oh, and masks are bad because you can't breathe very well." It's like, well, oxygen and carbon dioxide are way smaller than SARS-CoV-2. So which one is it? Is the mask impeding the flow of, you know what I mean? So just little things like that where their basic position could have been correct that, yeah, masks in general don't, especially like a surgical mask doesn't really protect you much if you're in a room with 2 hours with someone who's positive for COVID-19. And if you wear a mask all day, that might, give you a headache or something. But the way they were trying to explain it with these, quick little memes on Twitter or Facebook about the diameter of the thing, like they were contradicting each other. And if I brought that up, they would get mad at me and say, "Oh, so you're a statist." You know what I mean? So that's what was annoying. It was sort of like, we can use any argument that backs up what we want to do, whether or not it's a good argument, because, hey, the other side's lying too. So why don't we just say goofy things also because they're doing it?
Next question.
Good evening, Bob. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask you a question. I actually posted it in the chat. From what you're probably quite familiar with the work of Professor Hans Hermann Hoppe. And I would basically like to ask you, what do you think of his saying that that a sincere libertarian should be a conservative? And if yes, why so? How would you explain it? My other question is, well, would you agree with the statement with the medieval Europe, particularly the Italian republics, a good example of libertarian society? Well, and again, if yes, if you agree with that, how would you elaborate this? Thank you.
Okay. Well, so on the narrow, so strictly speaking, for me, a libertarian is someone who endorses the non-aggression principle. That's like the actual definition of what I mean if I'm saying libertarian. And so saying it would be immoral to initiate violence or coercion against someone who hasn't initiated against you. So it's basically saying you should respect property rights, or rather, it would be immoral to violate someone else's property rights. And then the question is, how do you define the property rights? So strictly speaking, somebody's cultural views, the religious views, things like that, you could be a hedonist who uses heroin every day and doesn't believe in marriage. You could be that and endorse the libertarian principles, or you could be a Calvinist and do the same thing. So strictly speaking, it's not that one logically entails the other. I do think, though, that a more traditional cultural society, and if that's what we mean by a conservative, that's more likely in practice to uphold libertarian values, right? So I can say, as far as the Italian republic, city states and things, I don't know enough about that. I think with a lot of historical things, different societies exhibit certain principles that you could look at and say, yes, this component of what I think a free society would be like, you can see very well illustrated in this time period in this region. Just like a lot of David Friedman uses medieval Iceland to illustrate some principles of how could decentralized private law work. Probably there's elements of medieval Iceland that would be shocking, and I don't want to live in a world like that. So,
well, I believe there's a guy from Mises Institute from UK, here Martland, and he actually got a series of lectures where he explained that whole medieval Europe was kind of a libertarian society, until a certain point. I mean, do you know, you're familiar with are you familiar with his ideas? Well, what do you think?
So I like I said, I've read certainly David Friedman talking about medieval Iceland. I have let's see. When you're asking about Italy, no, I have not read specific discussion of Italy in this context, so I can't comment on that. I mean, in general, like the idea of limited government and what's that's coming from Europe because of the Magna Carta and the arguments about princes just jockeying for power and barons, and that why is it our notion of limited government and classical liberalism came from that area of the world and not from China or not from Africa or not from the Native American Indians, and people can give that history. So certainly there's something about European culture. I'm a Christian, so I would argue the Judeo-Christian ethic has a lot to do with it for historical reasons. Why did that come through Europe and that region of the world? So I do think there is an element of what does the culture believe and what values does the population have, and what's that going to make them likely to embrace politically. But
because I mean, the major reason I'm asking that there's many opponents of the libertarian political theory, people are against, particularly people are against free markets, in favor of regulations. They always, when they hear the arguments for the free market, for the decentralized, non-monopolistic authority system, they say, they ask, can you bring up an example of that durable of such political system which was durable, which existed in here, which ever existed in history, and well, existed for a sufficient amount of time. And it is like it's always it's always an ordeal for an anarcho-capitalist, for libertarians to bring up such an example. So I was just wondering if you're aware of that. Well, of the or these political ideas been implemented. Practically implemented.
Okay, yeah. So on that one, you're right. Like, so for example, there's different regions, like the work of George Selgin and Larry White. You know, if you want to say, could you have a world with so-called free banking, you know, a society where banks are just regular businesses, and they can point to different, like Canada in a certain time period, and Scotland, and even like California, ironically, in certain areas at a certain time, had relatively unregulated banks, at least with free entry, and you didn't need a charter to come in. Like there were certain regulations. So yeah, like I say, for various elements, what we would say would characterize a libertarian free market society, you can go look, but there were conscription in the United States or Canada or Scotland in the periods in question, you know what I mean? So likewise, I don't think there's a period in history where I'm going to look at Europe and say, yeah, that's an example of, you know, basically no government. Or if there were, it wouldn't be very pleasant, right? So that's kind of what I'm getting at. You can see elements of it, because I mean, ultimately, if you did try to push it, let's say, in other words, the critic demanded that you pointed to it, and if you're going to say Europe, whatever time period you want, you know, from 1512 to 1580, it's pretty liberal. They would just say, okay, and that didn't last. And then Europe became, you know, the modern socialist interventionist state you can't stand, and led to World War I. And so by your own example, aren't you admitting your system doesn't last and turns into the Leviathan state? So, I mean, that's going to be the problem. If you go down that path in general, there obviously isn't some mecca of free market libertarianism from history that lasted, because it's not around.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you.
Interjecting. I just want to more people to have time asking questions. Anyone else?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, Bob.
Hi.
I'm asking you a question that I also asked Walter Block on a previous conversation. I'd like to hear your point on it, on the subject of centralization versus decentralization. I saw libertarians argue for both ends, and I'd like to hear your opinion. I know in the Texas aspect you're for decentralization, but I wonder if that's your thumb rule, or can you think of cases where the opposite is true?
Can you give me an example of, like, what kind of centralization do you think some libertarians support, just so I know what you mean? Like with Brexit, for example. Like, I know some libertarians.
Many people talk for the EU, for example, the open borders within it, that they claim it's a way to promote freedom. Right. Walter gave example that the federal government in the US prevented regulating rent, I think.
Okay.
Stuff like that.
Okay, great. Yeah. So empirically, yeah, it's always possible that in a particular instance, if a higher government power came in and prohibited certain like in the United States too, the various states can't have tariffs against each other. You know, like Florida is not allowed to have an extra tax on goods coming in from Georgia, for example. And so the US internally is a giant free trade zone, at least with respect to standard commerce. And I think that's a good thing. But yeah, in general, I do not want a higher political power imposing rules on a lower one, even if in some cases the rules were beneficial, is what I would say. Just like because you don't have to look at it in terms of centralization. You could just look at it as coercion in general and say, couldn't there be cases where, hey, someone's gonna become a heroin addict, and wouldn't it be good if someone went up to him with a gun and said, if you stick that needle in your arm, I'm going to shoot you, and then kept that person clean, and he went and got a job and raised a family, and 20 years later, he might thank you for sticking that gun in his face. Is that logically possible? Yes, but does that mean I favor, the selective use of guns to get people to change their behavior? No. So that's kind of the way I'd answer this, that yeah, you can come up with examples where maybe, but in general, once, that entity has that power. So certainly what the EU on net, I think, is hurting freedom and financial liberty. And on net, Washington, the federal government in the United States is restricting freedom. So even though you could find specific applications where maybe they're promoting it, I would say that no, in general, it's not. And then, yeah, the principle of it, the ethics of it, no, if you don't have the right to do something, then you shouldn't do it.
Next question.
Yes, you had...
Sorry, before that, Bob, how much time do we have left?
I probably got like 5 minutes.
Okay, so Noam, please go ahead.
You had a lecture about how security and defense would work in a ANCAP situation, society. I wanted to ask you a few questions, but we'll cut it down to one. How would you prevent in such a situation treason, or someone siding with the enemy for large amounts of money? I mean, if the king has oil, he can offer me $10 million to betray you. I can open a weapons store. I can attack you from behind. I can get close to your air bases, and so on and so forth. And you kind of can't stop me from arming. You can't stop me from providing weapons. You can't stop me from doing most of the things in an anarcho-capitalist society.
Okay, yeah, great question. Let me find what is that called? I'm just Googling something. I want to give you a paper title that I wrote, just to make sure. Okay, there it is. Yeah, so a lot of people are familiar with the lectures I gave at the Mises Institute on military defense, and then my booklet, Chaos Theory, which came out in the 2000s, I forget when. But in 2017, I had a journal article entitled Libertarian Law in Military Defense. So I get into much more specific, like talking about some of the things you're bringing up here. So I would say go read that if you really want to see the nuances. But real quickly, to answer your question, one way of, I don't think, for example, that in a libertarian society, you could stockpile atomic bombs in your basement, and the only moment the authorities are allowed to do anything to you is until you kill an innocent person. Like, I think, and it's different ways of how this would play out. But certainly if you're just a tenant in an apartment building, there's all sorts of things you wouldn't be allowed to do. And certainly that would include stockpiling, weapons of mass destruction. And even if you bought a house, in a neighborhood subdivision, there could be rules about, well, you're not allowed to play music at 3 o'clock in the morning that bothers the neighbors. And, oh yeah, you're not allowed to stockpile sarin gas too. More generally, in terms of, an umbrella framework, I think insurance companies or like fraternal organizations would vouch for individuals, and that's what would give them access to segments of society. Like, you wouldn't be allowed to go work at a law office unless there was some kind of agency saying, if this person gets convicted of a crime that hurts, somebody at this office, then, we'll pay the fee, we'll pay the compensation ourselves. So people would be assured that. So if somebody's stockpiling very serious weapons, well, then those third parties aren't going to vouch for the person. So I just want to clarify that that's the way the framework would be. So it's not so much that seeing money getting funneled to someone might make you hesitant, but I'm saying in general, like if you have a utility company, like the thing that makes the electricity for the city in the ANCAP world, and you're worried about what if foreign armies, paid somebody, a traitor, to set up bombs next to it. I mean, even in general, what if just somebody domestically is crazy or just hates, where they live, and they want to go bomb that? I don't think that the electric company is particularly vulnerable to a terrorist attack in a free society versus a statist society. And so whether or not they're getting paid by some outside entity, whatever mechanisms would protect them, I'm saying are still going to be there. Now, also too, you have sophisticated surveillance and whatnot, that the way in a statist society you would stop that is, oh, you'd have intelligence networks to know if somebody's getting funded by Al-Qaeda, and then we can go look at them. Well, you could still do that in a free society too, or you couldn't like look at people's bank records necessarily, but I'm saying a lot of data collection and things could happen through purely voluntary means. And so if you thought there was somebody who was likely to be stockpiling weapons, I think there probably actually would be a lot of mechanisms, even in a totally free society, to minimize the damage they could inflict.
Okay, Bo, do we have time for one more?
Maybe one real quick one.
Well, in that case, that's going to be a question from me. I'll take the opportunity since I'm managing this course, so why not? So the question is, I know that I understand how the US can be a stateless society. I can understand how a country as powerful and rich as the US can defend itself even under conditions of, no government, no central government. Can you say the same thing for a country like Israel? Can Israel or any other small country that is, that has bad relationships with its enemies, can a country like Israel, a stateless society here, be efficient enough to defend itself without a central government?
Okay, so what I would say is it's just a matter of apples to apples comparisons. So yeah, a small group of 50 people who lived on the outskirts of Nazi Germany are not going to be able to stop a Panzer division from rolling over them. But likewise, the French government didn't stop them either, right? So you have to do apples to apples. So I'm saying the claim is not that, oh, if you have a free society, it's going to be so efficient that no matter how small it is, no matter how primitive their technology, they're always going to be able to repel any invasion. The claim is if you've got a group of people, given their level of technology, given their aggressiveness, how many weapons they have at the beginning of the thought experiment, are they going to become better at defending themselves if a subset of those people declare themselves the government and then monopolize the military defense aspect and start taxing them and saying, okay, this is how we're going to defend ourselves now? And I would say, generally speaking, no, that you always hamper your efforts. Just like if they want to maximize oil production, you wouldn't first set up a government to make sure you do it right. Like that begs the question, well, we don't know the right way to extract oil. You let the market figure that out. And so likewise, you can't say, well, let's have a government in charge to defend ourselves the best way. We don't know what the best way is. Maybe there's some new idea for this particular geographical configuration, and given the people we have at our disposal and the weapons we happen to have and so forth, maybe there's this novel way of doing it. And this one guy over here would have thought of it, but he's not going to be part of the government. And so you need to have freedom to allow that idea to pop up. So that's what I would say. So it's, I don't want to be naive. I understand I'll put it to this, I'll close with this. I was actually surprised with the pandemic. I'm living in the United States. I was shocked at how long it took a lot of businesses to start supplying masks and gloves and even like the wipes, like Clorox. I don't know if the brand Clorox means anything, you guys. Is that international? Okay. It's hard to get Clorox wipes in the store, right? Because hospitals immediately were getting the full supply. And so those disappeared from the stores, like paper towels and toilet paper, things like that too. But those came back soon. But the Clorox name brand wipes, even a year later, were still not available to regular people. Like that shocked me. So I'm much more modest about my expectations about how efficient private business could just completely change and adapt to a new situation. But on the other hand, the more I learn about how government works, it's worse than I thought when I was 20 years old. You get what I'm saying? So it's more like I'm just more disappointed in humans now than I was 20 years ago. So I'm just saying that, yeah, in general, setting up a government doesn't make a group of people more effective at something, whether that's building computers or teaching children how to read or defending yourselves from a military invasion.
Okay, got you. Okay, I think we kept you long enough. So thanks everyone for being on this call. Obviously, thank you, Bob, for taking the long time to speak with us. And all of this, everything was recorded, so I'm going to put it up on YouTube in a couple of days, I hope, and then you can revisit it. So again, Bob, thank you very, very much for your time.
Okay, thanks. Thank you for hosting
Thank
me, and
you.
thanks everybody.